I'm Adi Ignatius, Editor-in-Chief of the Harvard Business Review, and welcome to the IdeaCast. Today our topic is Lessons on Leadership from Nelson Mandela and Barack Obama. I have with me two authors of recent books about these men. Rick Stengel, the managing editor of Time magazine, who has written the book Mandela's Way, and David Remnick, the editor of The New Yorker, who has just written a book about Barack Obama called The Bridge. We're here at the New Yorker's offices in New York City, and I want to thank both of you for meeting today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Rick, you spent a lot of time with Nelson Mandela, and I assume you have a feeling about this. You know, are people like him born with these remarkable traits, remarkable leadership abilities, or is this something that you learn along the way?
I think it's always a combination. I mean, what people forget about Nelson Mandela is that he's an incredible specimen. I mean, he's 6'2" tall, had broad shoulders, has a great smile. In fact, Walter Sisulu, his longtime colleague, once said to me the day he met Nelson Mandela in this little real estate office in Soweto, I said, we wanted to be a mass movement, and then a mass leader walked into my office. But it was a combination of his natural endowment and those 27 years in prison, which were a kind of crucible for him that actually created his character, that created so many of those leadership qualities that we know when he came out. His measuredness, his calmness, his forgiveness. Those things he learned in prison, and that was combined with his innate endowment.
Mm-hmm. David, let me ask you, now, picking up on the crucibles of leadership idea, what have been, obviously Obama has a different arc, but what have been the crucibles that have tested him?
Well, I think to be very fair here, we have to say that the past of Barack Obama before he hits the White House door is so much more modest historically than the achievement of Nelson Mandela, and the suffering of it doesn't even begin to be in the same sentence or paragraph. So with that caveat to move forward, look, I think the first real crucible on a big national level, the first time Barack Obama is really in a competitive election campaign, it's not till he runs for president. When he ran for state senate, unopposed. When he ran for Congress, he was defeated by more than 2-1. When he ran for Senate in 2004, his strongest opponents dropped out of the race because of all kinds of marital scandals. And he ended up running against who? Alan Keyes. So it is important when discussing the story of Barack Obama to remember good fortune and how relatively smooth a ride it was. So when we're talking about him next to Nelson Mandela, there's almost a preposterous level. But when he gets to the presidential race, his capacity to project certain elements of leadership, of temperament, of intelligence, of calm, of fluidity compared to his predecessor in the White House were extremely winning.
Rick, let's go back to Mandela. I mean, it's often said that a true leader appeals not just to people's minds, but to people's hearts as well.
Right. He would always say that you must appeal to the heart as well as to the head. I mean, there are similarities with Obama. I mean, the kind of preternatural calm that Obama has, Mandela has as well, but he earned it. He achieved it through all of those years in prison. And in fact, one of the things that, in terms of appealing to the head and the heart, that he learned in prison was he realized if he is ever going to unite South Africa and be a leader of white and black, Afrikaans and African, he has to understand the Afrikaner. He has to understand what makes them tick. He learned Afrikaans in prison, but he didn't just learn Afrikaans, he learned about Afrikaner history. He learned, you know, as much as he could about rugby, which is the great sport that you know, Afrikaners love. I mean, I think we saw this in the movie Invictus, the idea that, you know, that Obama needed to appeal to not only the heads of whites, but the hearts as well. And the way he did that is preaching reconciliation by saying, I forgive you. Let's move past what happened before. What unites us is greater than what divides us. And again, I think a great tribute to his leadership is, so many people would say to me, it's amazing that he's not bitter or angry. Well, I can tell you, he's incredibly bitter and angry. But he realized he could not show that. He could not demonstrate that. He had to come out and seem to be a man of reconciliation, of generosity, of forgiveness. He has tremendous wounds that he would never let anybody see. But I think a tribute to his leadership was that he said, you know what, I cannot ever show that. I'll never achieve harmony, I'll never achieve reconciliation if I show anything like that, and he didn't.
Well, I think actually Rick makes a fantastic point, and the best way to look at these two figures, if you're going to look at them side by side, is as of teacher and pupil. That the crucibles that Mandela has gone through are so much greater. I mean, he's on the level Mandela is of the Sakharovs of the world, and Havel. And Mandela, like Havel, was somebody who was both dissident and then became a reconciling statesman. The attractive modesty of Obama, and there's also an enormous ego, but the attractive modesty of Obama is to recognize that somebody like King is not his parallel, but a kind of exalted teacher, and so is Mandela. And reconciliation certainly is the language of Obama, but it doesn't always work. It worked more in politics, it worked more in winning in Virginia and North Carolina and Colorado than it did in the healthcare debate.
But okay, now, part of what you're talking about in both cases is self-discipline and self-restraint. But there's also, I think, part of leadership in both men's cases is kind of the art, the theater, the poetry, the drama, and that's a little bit different. And you know, Mandela seemed to understand that.
Yes, I actually have a chapter about his love and fascination with clothing, for example. And I know that seems superficial, but it's not. It basically, clothes make the man, and in the sense that you have to embody the role that you want to be. He was always very careful what he wore at every event because he wanted to represent that thing that he wanted people to think of him as. And again, being a black man in South Africa in the 1950s, and he was a young lawyer, for example, he was always careful to wear three-piece suits to court because, remember, he was treated as less than human by people, and he wanted to look like what he seemed to be. Many times, for example, he had an incredible instinct for this. I used to spend, you know, I would travel with him all over the place when he was speaking, and we would wait in the back of his car, this BMW that he always traveled in, and he would wait for the absolute precise moment to come out, when the crowd was ready for him, you know, when the television cameras were there. And I mean, I was always like, come on, let's go. And he would just calmly sit there. I mean, he had a real sense of drama and stagecraft, which I think, by the way, is something that's really important for leaders and especially important for politicians.